So, imagine you live in a neighborhood where the homeowners association has this really specific, really violent rule.
Uh-oh. That doesn't sound good.
No, it's intense. Basically, if your neighbor builds an extension on their house or, gets a significant raise at work or even just buys a slightly faster car, you are legally obligated to burn their house down.
That is a wildly stressful place to live.
Extremely. But here's the kicker. You don't burn it down because they threatened you. And you don't do it because they're mean. You do it because they might eventually become powerful enough to tell you what to do.
Right.
So you strike now to prevent this purely hypothetical scenario 10 years down the road.
It's literally paranoia codified into law.
Exactly. But the crazy thing is, for over 150 years, this wasn't some dystopian novel. This was the official operating system of Europe. We call it the balance of power.
And, while it sounds like a very graceful, static concept, like a scale sitting perfectly still, it was actually this chaotic, incredibly bloody engine that essentially defined the modern world.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. We are unpacking what the sources call the architecture of equilibrium. We're looking at European history from roughly 1648 to 1815.
It's a fascinating period.
Truly. And looking through these sources, I realized this isn't just a dry list of battles and dates. It's a high-stakes chess game where the pieces are actual nations, the board is the whole world, and the only way to win is to make absolutely sure no one else wins too big.
That is a perfect framing for the listeners. Today we are going to explore how the fear of one megastate drove everything, from the wars of Louis XIV to the literal destruction of Poland, and even the creation of the tax forms you hate filling out today.
Wait, hold on. We're going to blame the IRS on 17th century geopolitics.
Oh, absolutely we are. The modern state was quite literally built to fight these specific types of wars. But before we get to taxes, I think we have to start with the massive vibe shift. The sources pinpoint 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, as the moment everything changed.
Right, so before 1648, you have the 30 Years' War, which, from what I remember from the materials, was just an absolute nightmare of religious violence.
Yes.
Just Catholics versus Protestants completely tearing Central Europe apart.
It was an ideological, total war. But Westphalia acts as this psychological break for the continent. The powers of Europe look at the ashes and essentially say, okay, we are never going to agree on religion. We simply can't keep burning down the continent over whose version of Christianity is correct.
So religion just completely exits the chat as the primary motivation for war.
Largely, yes. It gets replaced by this concept of raison d'etat, reason of state. It's a huge shift towards secular self-interest.
Interesting.
Rulers stop fighting for the soul of Europe, and they start fighting for the very specific, pragmatic interests of their dynasty. They want land, they want secure trade routes, and they want security for their heirs.
So it becomes less emotional and a lot more mathematical.
Precisely. It becomes a cold calculation of power. And this is where the balance of power doctrine really takes over. The core idea is incredibly simple. No single state can ever be allowed to become a hegemon.
Because if one state becomes too strong, independent sovereignty just becomes impossible for everyone else, right?
Exactly. No one can dominate the others.
So let's say I'm the King of England or the Emperor of Austria, and I see France getting really strong, they're building forts, maybe expanding their army. I have to treat that as an immediate threat, even if they haven't laid a finger on me.
Yes, that is what historians call the defensive paradox. To maintain peace, which they define simply as the absence of a single tyrant, you had to be constantly ready to launch proactive wars.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. You don't wait for France to invade you. You invade France first, or you fund their enemies to knock them down a peg. You fight a limited war today to prevent a total conquest tomorrow.
It's basically the tall poppy syndrome of geopolitics. If a poppy grows too high, the other flowers band together to chop its head off.
That's a very vivid image, but perfectly accurate. And speaking of tall poppies, we really have to talk about the main antagonist of this entire era, the guy who tested the system more than anyone else.
Louis XIV of France, the Sun King.
The ultimate disruptor.
Reading through the notes on his reign, the sheer audacity of the man is incredible. He wasn't interested in maintaining any kind of balance. He wanted glory. He wanted to make France the new Rome.
And he genuinely had the resources to do it. France was the most populous, wealthiest state in Western Europe at the time. Louis wanted to push France's borders to what he called their natural limits.
Which meant taking the Rhine River, the Alps, the Pyrenees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But every single time he moved a muscle to grab territory in the Netherlands or Germany, the system reacted immediately.
This is the part of the sources that felt almost like a superhero movie to me. Or, well, maybe a supervillain movie. Louis makes a move, and instantly a coalition forms against him. It's almost never just France versus Spain. It's France versus everyone.
That's the mechanism at work. Look at the 9 Years' War starting in 1688. Louis tries to expand into the Holy Roman Empire. Immediately, you get the formation of the Grand Alliance.
Right.
You have the Austrian Habsburgs, the Dutch Republic, England, Spain, Sweden, and Savoy, all joining forces against him.
And these countries were definitely not friends normally, right?
Not at all. I mean, the Dutch and the English were fierce commercial rivals. They fought brutal wars over maritime trade. But they looked at Louis XIV and said, he's the bigger threat. They feared a French superstate way more than they hated each other.
It's the classic, the enemy of my enemy is...
My temporary ally until the check clears.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, it worked. Louis established himself as the most powerful monarch in Europe, but he couldn't actually conquer it. The coalitions acted like a massive containment wall.
They did, but there was one specific moment where that containment wall almost completely crumbled. The War of the Spanish Succession.
Oh man, this was the ultimate crisis point. The mega-state nightmare we mentioned earlier.
Yes. So the King of Spain, Charles II, was a Habsburg. He was very sickly, and he had no children to inherit the throne. When he died in 1700, he left his entire empire to Philip V.
And Philip just so happened to be Louis XIV's grandson.
Right. So I want you to look at the map for a second. You have France, the dominant military power on the continent. And now, potentially, you have Spain with its massive navy and its colossal empire in the Americas.
We're talking Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean.
All of it. All controlled by the exact same family, the Bourbons.
If those two resources combine, the balance is completely gone. That creates a superpower that literally no coalition could ever stop.
It would have been game over for independent Europe, period. So the rest of the continent goes to war for over a decade just to stop it from happening. It was an incredibly brutal, grinding conflict.
And the resolution to this, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, is really fascinating to me. Because reading the sources, it feels more like a complicated legal settlement than a military victory. It's not a total win for anyone.
It's a victory for the system itself. The compromise they reached was this. Philip V gets to stay King of Spain. So the Bourbons do technically win the throne. But the treaty contains a very strict legal clause.
The French and Spanish crowns can never be united on the same head.
Exactly. They must remain separate legal entities forever.
So the lawyers basically stepped in and said, look, you can be cousins, but you absolutely cannot be business partners.
Essentially, yes. They prioritized the equilibrium of the geopolitical structure over the divine rights of the dynasty. It really showed that the balance of power was now the supreme law of Europe.
Now, while all this intense drama is happening in Paris and London, the sources make a strong point that we can't ignore the East. There was a major external player actively trying to kick the door down.
The Ottoman Empire. It's true, we often get so incredibly focused on Western Europe that we forget the Ottomans were a massive superpower pushing up from the Balkans.
And this tension culminates in the Siege of Vienna in 1683, which honestly feels like the highest stakes moment in the whole timeline.
It truly was. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg Empire. If Vienna falls, the Ottoman army has a clear, unobstructed path right into the heart of Central Europe. It would have fundamentally altered the entire history of the West.
And again, we see that coalition mindset kick in.
Yeah.
Because who shows up to save the city? It's not just the Austrians.
It's a massive joint force. You have the Austrians, various German states, and most famously, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. King Jan Sobieski of Poland leads what is considered the largest cavalry charge in human history.
Something like 18,000 horsemen, right?
Yes, charging down the hills to completely smash the Ottoman siege lines.
It's such a heroic moment. Poland saves civilization. Poland preserves the balance.
They absolutely did. And this brings us to what I think is the darkest irony of this entire deep dive. Poland plays by the rules, they shed their blood to help save the system in 1683, and then less than a century later...
Poland doesn't exist. This is the part of the reading that really makes you realize how cold and mechanical this system actually was. The erasure of Poland. How does the largest territorial state in Europe just vanish from the map?
It is the ultimate cautionary tale of the balance of power. In this system, sovereignty isn't a fundamental right. It is a privilege of the strong. If you are weak, you aren't a player sitting at the table. You are the meal being served.
But why was Poland considered weak? You just said they had these amazing cavalrymen that saved Vienna.
They had incredibly brave soldiers, yes, but they had a completely paralyzed government. Poland was a constitutional monarchy where the landed nobles held almost all the power. They had this parliamentary rule called the liberum veto.
Right, I wanted to ask about this. It meant that a single noble could veto any law.
One single guy. If he didn't like a new tax or a military reform, he literally just stood up and said, "I do not allow it." And the entire legislative session dissolved.
That is insane. One guy could stop the entire functioning of the government.
Yes. So while countries like France and Prussia were rapidly building centralized states, Poland was completely gridlocked. They couldn't collect taxes effectively, which meant they couldn't pay for a modern standing army.
They were essentially a medieval structure trying to survive in a modern world.
Exactly. And their neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, were hungry wolves. In the late 1700s, there was huge tension between Russia and Prussia over Ottoman lands. They were right on the brink of a massive war.
And this is where Frederick the Great of Prussia comes up with what the sources call the cynical solution.
He essentially looks at the situation and says, why should we shed our own blood fighting each other? Let's just carve up Poland instead to satisfy our territorial appetites.
Let's eat the weak guys so we don't have to fight each other. That is chilling.
It is ruthless pragmatism at its absolute peak. Between 1772 and 1795, they conducted 3 separate partitions. They just sliced off chunks of Polish territory piece by piece.
Until there was nothing left.
Right. In 1795, the King of Poland abdicated, and the country was completely wiped off the map for over 150 years.
So the grand noble balance of power was preserved by literally destroying an entire nation.
Yes, the peace between the great powers was bought and paid for with the existence of Poland. It proved that in this specific architecture, if you cannot effectively defend yourself, you have absolutely no right to exist.
Which brings us perfectly to the how of survival. You mentioned Poland died because it couldn't pay for an army. The sources keep referring to a military revolution occurring in this period.
Yeah.
It really seems like the engine room of the whole balance system.
It really is. This is where we see the actual birth of the modern state. Before this era, armies were often just feudal levies, temporary forces raised for a single fighting season and then sent home for harvest.
Right.
But to fight these constant, highly calculated wars of equilibrium, you needed permanent standing armies.
Like Louis XIV's army. The sources said he reached 400,000 men.
400,000 men who need to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid every single day, year-round. Plus, you have this massive technology shift happening. Gunpowder, standardized muskets, and heavy artillery.
And the countermeasure to that artillery, those crazy star forts.
Yes, the Trace Italian. These were low, incredibly thick, geometric brick walls specifically designed to deflect incoming cannonballs. They were astronomically expensive to build.
Right, because you can't just throw up a wooden palisade anymore.
Exactly. And because of these forts, wars turn into these really long, grinding sieges.
So war basically stops being about a brave knight charging across a field, and it starts being about who has the deepest pockets.
That is the exact transition. War becomes a pure test of financial endurance. And this is the critical link the sources make. To pay for this massive year-round military machine, kings had to fundamentally change how they governed their people.
Because the old ways weren't enough.
Right. You couldn't just rely on the income from your own personal royal estates anymore. You needed to tax the entire population, systematically and relentlessly.
And to tax people systematically, you actually need to know who they are, where they live, and what they own.
Correct. You need a bureaucracy. You need census takers, professional tax collectors, accountants, logistical officers. You essentially need a state in the modern sense of the word.
So the countries that succeeded in doing this, places like France, Prussia, England, they built this administrative infrastructure.
They built what historians call state capacity.
And the countries that didn't do this,
Like Poland, they perished. Because they couldn't force their nobility to pay taxes, they couldn't field the professional army needed to protect their borders. The military revolution made bureaucratic efficiency a literal matter of life and death.
that is just wild to think about. We usually think of bureaucracy as just the boring stuff, the red tape that gets in the way of daily life. But in the 17th century, bureaucracy was the ultimate weapon of survival.
It was. The pen wasn't just mightier than the sword. The pen literally paid for the sword. Without the accountants, the armies couldn't march.
So let's zoom out and look at the whole picture for our listeners. From the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, all the way to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, We have this complex system that replaces religious zealotry with highly calculated dynastic warfare.
We have a system actively designed to prevent a universal monarchy. And for all its flaws, it worked. It prevented Europe from being completely homogenized under one single empire, the way we saw with China or ancient Rome.
Right. It allowed for a pluralistic system of sovereign states, which sounds like a good thing. It allowed distinct cultures to develop. You get distinct French culture, German culture, Italian culture.
It absolutely did, but we always have to look at the immense cost. The price of that pluralistic stability was constant, grinding warfare. There was barely a single year in that entire period without a major conflict happening somewhere on the continent.
And it required the sacrifice of the weak. The rights of a small nation only existed if they had the cannons and the tax base to back them up.
It really is a double-edged sword. On one hand, you successfully avoid the rise of a single tyrant who controls everything. On the other hand, you create a continental system where everyone is living in a state of permanent paranoid preparation for violence.
And that paranoia, the sheer terror of falling behind, drove the creation of the powerful, highly centralized states that we all live in today. The architecture of equilibrium wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. It literally built the skeleton of the modern nation-state.
That is exactly the main takeaway.
It leaves you with a really uncomfortable question, though. We look back at this era as the grand foundation of modern international relations. But was the stability of the balance of power actually worth the price paid in blood and the total erasure of sovereign nations?
That is something to think about the next time you hear diplomats talking about global stability and the international order.
A very sobering thought to end on. Next time you hear about the balance of power on the news, just remember it is a very old game and the rules are written in some very fine, very bloody print. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.